This program is a production of SECA. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Bob Shrum, a Democratic political consultant who makes a lot of the 30-second ads so many people say they hate but seem to respond to. There is no subject more on the minds of Americans today than what Daniel Yergin, one of the world's leading energy consultants, calls the epic quest for oil, power, and money. Mr. Yergin's new book about the development of the oil industry is called The Prize, and that prize in great part is the reason why America has now deployed one of the great armed expeditions of history to the Persian Gulf. Mr. Yergin's book is brilliant, important, and interesting. Did you know, for example, that the first oil pipeline was essentially a liberal project, an effort on the part of independent producers in Pennsylvania to break the monopoly power of John D. Rockefeller? Mr. Rockefeller, of course, solved the problem by buying the pipeline. Dan Yergin chronicles the long journey from the first oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, to the attack on Kuwait City. Not only our industry, he argues, but world politics itself has been driven by the availability, price, and control of petroleum. Not one, but many wars have been fought over it. Mr. Yergin raises provocative questions about the age of oil. Will this society ever take real measures to reduce our use of oil? How dependent are we willing to be? How many wars will have to be fought? And how will we balance the endless demand for energy with the increasing demands to protect the environment? As Mr. Yergin writes, ours is a century in which every facet has been transformed by the alchemy of petroleum. So let me start the discussion with a question from Mr. Buckley. Bill, given recent events, do you think it would be better to allow drilling in environmentally sensitive offshore areas than to send more troops and run the risk of more confrontations like the one in the Persian Gulf?
Well, preferably both. The loaded questions suggest to us how successful he is with those 30-second ads, right?
Yes. I was wondering where he was going to come out with this question.
But let me ask you this. You run into it, as I do, Tendenz's reference to the word oil. I don't want my son to fight in order to keep the price of oil down. I don't think, actually, that Mr. Bush has succeeded in communicating anything with anything like the success that you do in this book. The utter and total necessity of oil, which goes even beyond my sense of its palpability. But talk to us a minute or two about, people think of oil as it heats the house and it runs your car. Yeah. But you have almost a tone poem there about what oil does and to the extent to which we are dependent on it. Remind us of our obligations to it.
Well, it seems to me that our whole society is really shaped by oil and that we continue to live in an oil age, even as we talk about the information age and biotechnology down the road, and that it has shaped determined where we live, how we commute, how we travel, how we conduct our courtships. One of my favorite statistics is...
Yeah, 40% of marriages are contracted in, I didn't say consummated, well, contracted.
Or proposed.
Proposed, yeah.
In automobiles. And of course, we never stop to think of these cities that we live in are totally unself-sufficient. We would have no food here were it not for the petroleum that goes into fertilizers and then to move it here. And of course, plastics and new materials. So it's really so pervasive to our society that we don't really see it.
Well, now, that being the case, does it, in your judgment, simply destroy the argument that oil isn't something important enough to go to war for?
The way I see it is that the stakes are very large, that the control of oil has been a key factor really throughout the 20th century. It was central to the conduct and the outcome of the Second World War. And that when we look at the Persian Gulf, we're looking at a region with 65% of world oil reserves. So the question is not 5 cents more or less at the pump, as some people in a sense have trivialized it, but it is a question, which has been a question for the United States since the late 1940s, about whether we would want to see a single hostile power potentially or actually dominate that region. And, we certainly do not import all of our oil, unlike other countries. We import half of our oil, but the number that stands out in my mind is that we import more oil than Germany and Japan combined. So we are very sensitive to what happens to world oil.
Well, would it be fair to say, as sort of a rough geopolitical generality, that the control of oil is comparable to the control of gold in past centuries, or the control of industrial capacity in the last couple, or the control of a navy in the 19th century?
Yeah.
Is it that critical to the actual importance of a country?
Yeah, I think in a sense, it's a mixture of those. It's a source of money, and it's a source of power, both literally and figuratively.
And if that is correct, then we are profoundly involved in the requirement to use our power to prevent that from being monopolized in the hands, especially of somebody whose designs are less than specific.
Yes, I mean, all we have to do is read his lips.
Now, what follows from that, it seems to me, urges us on towards something you don't touch on in your book, but it seems to be it seems to be an inherent part of the thesis of the direction in which you're moving, which is really that oil needs international regulation.
Well, that has been a constant effort, really since the 19th century, to find some way to stabilize or tame this very wild commodity. And we in the United States have very mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand, it goes very much against our whole antitrust tradition. On the other hand, when you see the price bounce around, when it goes too low, producers want some kind of support or protection, and when it goes too high, consumers are certainly demanding action.
Well, might one say about oil that the moment it is discovered, it ought to be considered internationally accessible at a price that is set with reference to the realities. I guess what I'm trying to say is that your book is so convincing about our dependence on oil that you might almost be speaking about air, the air we breathe. Without air, we would asphyxiate. Without oil, there would be the industrial equivalent of asphyxiation. If that is so, and a huge pool of oil is discovered in Upper Volta, would you be hospitable to the thesis that it becomes there and then an international resource? Obviously making allowances for the fact that primary royalties and so on should be paid to the country in which it is discovered.
Well, if you could work out a system, it's a very interesting thing. We actually, towards the end of the World War II, the U.S. and Britain tried to set up such an international petroleum commission. But
and we tried, above all, we tried to set up with nuclear.
Yes.
With the atom.
Yes.
And we failed because it was veto power.
Yeah. I would think that I don't see how you, in a world of nation states, how you can get to that. It seems to me, I mean, you raise a very provocative question, and it may be the way to handle it is to the degree that oil can be governed by economics and the marketplace rather than political agendas. The better off in the long term most everybody will be. And it is an interesting thing that after the oil crises of the 70s, the ultimate victims of those high price, those shocks, were the oil exporters themselves, who for the most part learned the lesson that that they need to have long-term stable relationships with the consumers, with us, because we will find alternatives, at least to a degree. And most of the oil exporters really learned that lesson and internalized it. There were one or two exceptions, one of whom was in Baghdad.
And what happened to the post-war experiment that you touched on a moment ago?
Well, the British liked it. It was kind of popular in Washington, but the state of Texas rose up in righteous indignation. They didn't like the idea of a bunch of New Deal bureaucrats and limeys determining what the production rates would be in the state of Texas, and even the school teachers in Texas protested that it would devastate the economy of Texas, and it faded away, particularly as Harry Truman got himself established in the White House and fired Harold Ickes, the Interior Secretary.
And yet, of course, they ceded that right to the Railway Commission.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it was done in Texas by Texans.
Well,
and as you point out, the Railway Commission, many people forget, did really play the regulatory role for the world oil industry from the days of 2 cent a barrel oil in Texas right up till the point when the U.S. ran out of our extra capacity that was our real cushion against crises at the end of the 1960s.
Well, but it seems to me that we've entered into an environmental age in which more and more becomes axiomatic that certain things that happen in Chernobyl affect Norway, and certain things that happen in the northwest forest of the United States affect Manitoba. And that what we have here really is a key to an insight that makes it possible to at least think out loud about the internationalization of commodities in order to impose negative sanctions, but also while protecting the private right of people to the proper degree of exploitation, to insist that it must become universally available.
I wonder, I'm interested to find you proposing or raising this kind of idea. I wonder, do you have an idea of how it would work and who would do it?
Well, no, but I've always been a Henry Georgist, and I do think that nature gives us a certain amount which can't be husbanded in the sense that the OPEC sought to do, causing maelstroms, and by the figures that you give and the examples that you cite, causing potential anarchy unless regulated. Now, here we have a Gulf crisis about which much has happened in the last few days, and I asked the question, I've been asking it for 6 months. Oughtn't we to say to Saudi Arabia, well, no, we've been in there and we've helped you during these very, very tough days. Now please sign a 50-year accord to sell oil at a price that makes it possible to revive OPEC. Would that be sound statesmanship in your light?
Well, if you could, it's certainly a very intriguing idea if you can get it to work in this era of nation states. And I mean, where it maybe really happens is not in a de jure, but in a de facto fashion, that people do make long-term relationships. But the problem, that, the one problem you always come down to is what is the just price? And the old joke has it, the punchline is it all depends whether you're a buyer or a seller.
Yeah, well, the Middle Ages had an answer there, secundum estinationem fore, according to the estimate of the market. But the market can't be trifled with.
Yes.
Now, they used to quote Galveston, Texas. The price of oil sold at whatever price is sold at Galveston, Texas. But now the people who sell futures really determine that. However, the price at which futures exchange would be different, obviously, if there were no politically permissible means of interfering with that.
Yes. You've really brought out for me, I came out of this book with two simplistic, almost banal lessons, and yet looking at this broad sweep of history. And that is, when it comes to oil, two things really count. One is politics, and the other is supply and demand. Mm-hmm. And I come away very impressed by the power of the market, and that even the efforts to control the market so often are more like riding a bronco or taming a horse, but it really does have its own nature. But the politics is equally important because of the unique strategic nature of this commodity.
Yeah, the very fact that there's one choke point right there in the Gulf, the closing of which would affect everybody in this room,
yes,
gives you an idea of the reach,
yes,
of this industry.
Yes, and that raising the questions about the wisdom of being excessively dependent upon one area. We keep having lessons. We've just been in the midst of the 6th oil crisis since the Second World War, and it does remind you of the kind of instability and the way this commodity, particularly under some market conditions, becomes very vulnerable to, call it accidents, political events. And my sense was last spring you could see that this oil market was tightening and was going to become vulnerable. Didn't know when it would be. And it leads, as a result of that, to very sort of ironic turnarounds. For instance, now, where is the greatest enthusiasm about new oil development to offset dependence on the Gulf? But the Soviet Union.
Yes, right,
Or if we can still call it the Soviet Union.
Right. Well, tell me this. Would it be feasible to levy, I know that you're in favor of import taxes on oil.
Or gasoline tax.
Or gasoline tax, yeah. Would it be feasible to levy a tax on imported oil with some reference to the cost of its development? For instance, let's say, let's not quarrel with the figures if I happen slightly wrong. Let's say it cost 50 cents to pull a barrel of oil out of the sands of Saudi, and $10 to pull a barrel of oil out of the North Sea. Would it be feasible to levy a differential tax depending on whether you're importing North Sea oil or 50-cent oil? The purpose of that tax being to make it economical for them to bring in the oil, but penalizing them to the extent that they seek to extort to extort a value for the sale of it, which is unrealistic.
Well, I'd like to come at that question from the other end, which is, what do you do with an oil import fee? What are the other purposes? And that is one of the different mechanisms to address what seems to me to be one of the serious problems on the energy agenda, which is the fact that U.S. oil production has plummeted. I mean, it went down 2 million barrels a day between 1986 and 1990. To put that into context, that's greater than what Kuwait or Venezuela was producing before the Gulf crisis began. And I think that the rapid fall in U.S. oil production and a rapid rise in imports is bad for us and is destabilizing for the world. It's something that we don't want.
And that could have been avoided how? By a series of taxes?
We could have done either. We could have adjusted our fiscal regime, use the word taxes, and made it more feasible to keep certain oil production going. Every other non-OPEC country did it, or you could use an oil import fee. I mean, there's no perfect mechanism for it. But I was struck some months ago when I was in Japan, and Japanese, before the crisis began, said, how could the United States allow all these so-called stripper wells, you know, produce 3, 5, 10 barrels a day, to disappear because they're never going to come back? And how could a superpower allow the strategic resource when you could have tinkered with your tax code a little bit and kept them going? Didn't have a very good answer except to say that our country is very contorted and engages in sectarian warfare when it comes to energy questions, including oil.
By, for instance, confiscatory taxation?
By not looking. I see you wink over at our friend over there. I didn't hear his reply.
Talking about one of his bills.
To talk till the end.
I see, to set this all straight. This is what this is leading up to. But that it is something that no one really wanted to pay attention to, and yet you could see in the numbers that our situation was changing and that our life, the way we live, continues to be oil dependent. If anything, we were becoming more oil dependent because gasoline was so cheap.
Well, when you say in your book that this is going to continue for at least into the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, you were rather reluctant to specify what's going to ultimately relieve my great-grandchildren, your grandchildren, of this dependence. Is it nuclear energy?
Well, I think that I felt maybe one oil crisis ago in the late 70s and early 80s that the answers were clearer than I think they are today. And I would have thought that the oil age would have been ended sooner. And some would say nuclear, I would have thought renewable energy. But we saw the resilience of oil because it was so darn competitive. The price came down and really nothing could compete with it. And so people who were, for instance, in the renewable energy business development in the 1980s.
Went out of business.
Yeah, the main activity they had in the 1980s was sending their resumes around and trying to change careers. And now, you know, I think we'll probably start up again. But one of the numbers I came across that really struck me is the Japanese now spend more on energy research and development than the United States, which just shows that our priorities.
Now, in Japan, how is their nuclear power industry?
It is efficient. It is has generally.
What percentage of electricity does it yield?
I don't have that number in my head, but it's certainly they've made a big bet on it. It's slowed down somewhat. It doesn't have quite the momentum that it did have. But
because of the environmental bugs?
Yeah, there's an environmental opposition, more broadly based one that has developed in Japan over the last 2 or 3 years.
And this, in your judgment, is this on the order of a superstition? The spastic anti-nuclear bias.
Is that a leading question?
No,
There's no value judgment in that.
I thought I phrased that so disinterestedly.
Yes, objectively we might even say. I think you're into a world of values that clearly, for the most part, we've had a very well-managed nuclear power program in this country and most parts of the world, and a lot of the emotion or uncertainty depends on the risk, the 1% or 1/2 of 1% chance, and I think it's it's broadly based. Indeed, what I think I see in our society is this this third wave of environmentalism that these values have become so strong throughout the society, cutting across all the traditional demographic splits that might even be reflected in this room, although it will be tested again in this recession that we're in now. And to me, if I say, well, what are the unanswered questions? I see one of the major unanswered questions: how do we resolve these trade-offs between environmental considerations and energy requirements? And again, it's an obvious point to raise, but when you stand back and look at it, you see all these individual battles, but how do you put the pieces together and assess the risk? And I certainly don't have an answer to that, but I think it's a question we'll be wrestling with constantly in this country.
Well, I think one responsibility surely is to inquire into what the odds actually are. It's terribly easy to get panicked, about one missing last word, or well, I guess what I'm saying is that the safety record seems to be rather extraordinary in the development of the nuclear industry, and I'd have thought that somebody who emphasizes, as you do, the dangerous reliance that we have on oil would be an enthusiast for alternative.
Yes. The thing about, of course, most of the oil has been squeezed out of our electrical system, and so it's not as tightly linked as it was in the past. But I am carrying in my briefcase a paper that I'm reading very carefully on the second generation of nuclear power, which seems to be what would be required in the country to get the broader support and to give a utility executive the confidence and courage to order a plant, because he's making a 10-year bet and he doesn't know what's going to happen, or she doesn't know what's going to happen in those 10 years.
Well, the only kind of encouragement that he can realistically hope for is statutory, right? He's got to be protected from the fanatics and the opportunists who triple the cost of the plant by a series of lawsuits whose objective is primarily dilatory. Isn't that the kind
that's gentlemen, pardon me, our time is up. And listening to this discussion, one has the sense that the world, too, is rapidly running out of time, that our wisdom in dealing with the age of oil is about as scarce as gasoline during an embargo. I probably don't agree with Mr. Buckley in dismissing all the concerns about nuclear power, but he's surely right that if we're going to, and I think most Americans would agree, that if we're going to defend Saudi Arabia at the cost of lives and treasure, then we ought to be able to negotiate some more stable, long-term arrangement for the supply of oil. We're left with a question we keep coming back to in this program. What age of human history will succeed the age of oil, and can it sustain as high a standard of life? Mr. Yergin writes that the world is living on borrowed time. So, Dan, let me ask you, how long do we have? How long can we wait before we move away from this dependence on oil?
I would think that we should, sometime in the next century, we should have some technological alternatives to balance out the dependence upon oil.
And are those alternatives, as Mr. Buckley suggests, going to encounter consistently enormous political opposition?
Well, to me, the real alternatives right now are opaque.
Nuclear is not a real alternative.
I don't see it being the immediate or the solution in that regard. That I think we need a broader technological mandate. I believe in technological change. The history that I describe is one of technological change. But ask me what it is, and I can't give you that answer. I'm prepared to be surprised.
Bill, are you willing to give up on nuclear at any point?
Sure. I'd be willing to give it up if I thought it was suicidal. It seems to me that it might be interesting to experiment as follows, to have two sources of energy, say in New England. This is nuclear energy, and this is non-nuclear energy. And if you object to nuclear energy, then use this one, which costs twice as much. And after a while, there might be a certain attrition of one's superstitious opposition to nuclear energy. After all, 80% of the electrical power in France is nuclear, and there's not a lot of dead Frenchmen that I know about.
If I can add, I think that we've left one thing off the agenda, that there's still a lot of room for technological improvements in energy efficiency. Use that word of the past, energy conservation.
Yeah, but you run into the sin of scrupulosity. You know, people who feel that they can't really clean themselves because they got to wash themselves the 23rd time, and there's a point at which redundancy simply overwhelms the economic
Sure, but if we think about it in terms of technological improvement, it's we don't have to wash our hands quite as much.
No, that's true. And this professor at MIT, who's on a program in which you participated, maintains that the problem is substantially solved. I've been told we have to stop. Thank you very much, Mr. Yergin, author of it's got a long title, The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power. Thank you, Mr. Shrum. Thank you, gentlemen from Scarsdale.